The United States reimposes harsh sanctions on Iran, but both allies and adversaries refuse to follow the Trump administration's lead. Is this a new blow to American leadership, or the first sign a new global power structure is beginning to emerge? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Huda Abdelhamid. Earlier this week, Washington reimposed a wide range of sanctions on Iran. The move followed the U.S. decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear agreement, formerly known as the JCPOA. The Trump administration called on other powers to join it, but also issued a threat, telling governments to choose: do business with America or Iran, not both. The response has been a nearly universal no. Some of Washington's closest allies have even promised legislation to protect their own companies against possible American reprisals.
So are you at all concerned that countries like China, India, Russia might try to do a workaround that could make U.S. sanctions less effective?
No, actually, we're working with all countries to reduce oil imports from Iran to zero. We're making progress on that. We think these sanctions are biting already, and we think they will continue to bite and cause significant negative economic consequences for Iran.
We really just encourage the United States to start talking to its partners in Iran in order to be able to find a route forward.
Personally, in the meeting I had with President Trump, I made it clear that if the American intelligence has information that creates a different picture in terms of nuclear proliferation that was originally acquired, and the agreement that was reached is no longer effective, and if there had to be additional checks, in my opinion, Italy has to be willing to steer the relation with Iran in this direction.
This is not the first time the U.S. has tried to force other countries to go along with its unilateral sanctions. In 1996, the U.S. passed the Helms-Burton Act, a law strengthening the embargo against Cuba by penalizing foreign companies doing business there. Another law, dating from 1977, forced American companies not to follow the Arab boycott of Israel. But extraterritorial sanctions have sometimes been successful. In 2014, before the nuclear deal came into place, U.S. sanctions on Iran hit France's largest bank. BNP Paribas agreed to pay the U.S. Justice Department an $8.9 billion fine. So let's bring in our panel. In New Jersey, Stephen Rogers, member of the Donald J. Trump for President Advisory Board. In Birmingham, in the UK, Scott Lucas, Professor of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Birmingham. And in London, Anissé Bassiri Tabrizi, Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome to you all. Stephen Rogers, let me start with you. Why does the U.S. always assume that everybody has to just follow its lead, even if they don't agree?
Well, the U.S. doesn't automatically assume that. The president, under President Trump's administration, he believes in negotiating everything that he does. Now, look, with regard to Iran, the question each leader around the world has to answer is, what has Iran done to advance world peace? The answer is nothing. So the fact of the matter is that the regime has done nothing but create misbehavior around the world, has not lived up to its obligations regarding that horrible deal, and the United States is no longer on an apology tour as President Obama was. There's a new sheriff in town. His name is Donald Trump. Business is not going to be as usual. The EU and NATO and other countries have always wanted the United States government to take the lead on a lot of worldwide issues. President Trump is doing that, and now they've got to make decisions as to what side of the issue they're going to stand with. And at the end of the day, believe me, they will stand with the United States.
Scott Lucas, we just heard there is that, you know, the U.S. says that Iran doesn't help for world peace. Well, is pulling out of the deal or jeopardizing this deal going to bring any kind of world peace or bring us close to it?
No, first of all, I don't give two hoots for campaign talk. I mean, I care about political, economic, and military effects. I'm not a big fan of Iranian foreign policy and what it's doing in the region. For example, its support of the Assad regime in Syria with the killing of hundreds of thousands of people. But when we're talking about the deal itself, the deal is not, quote, the worst deal in history. The deal actually was containing Iran's nuclear program. 98% of uranium had been taken outside the country. It had restricted development of centrifuges. Iran was adhering to the deal. In other words, if you really want to deal with Middle Eastern problems, you needed to take the nuclear issue off the table. The deal did that by ripping up the deal, partly out of Donald Trump's spite over Barack Obama, and partly because of pursuit of regime change. You put the nuclear back in, you destabilize the region, you don't make it any better.
So, Anise Tabrizi, is there a feeling in Europe really that the US just pulled the rug from under the European countries' feet?
I think so. I think the Europeans have done their best to come to terms with even what were perceived as the concerns over the deal. The main things being the absence of the missile issue from the deal, the so-called sunset clause, and the type of inspection that are supposed to be conducted under the deal. The Europeans have been working with the US to try to address some of these concerns. And according to the same US State Department, there was significant progress between January and May, when the decision was taken by the US to withdraw from the deal, to address this concern. Despite that, the Trump administration decided to withdraw the US from the deal and put the Europeans in a very difficult position. The Europeans continue to be committed to the survival of the deal, and as we know, they continue to strengthen their support for it and to implement legislation that it's going to make it possible, even with limitation, for Iran to continue to abide by its own obligation. But of course, it's going to be very tricky for the Europeans and Russia and China to enable the deal to survive without the US being a party of it.
Okay, so Steve, I just need to understand this JCPOA deal is a multilateral deal with several countries involved. Now, the US is going alone on this so far. You seemed quite confident in your first answer that everyone else will follow suit. But why not also listen to the position of the Europeans, their concerns, and also why not give them some leeway when it comes to their own relationship or their part of that deal?
The president is listening to the other world leaders. I remember when he was involved with discussions with NATO, and there was a narrative around the world that he's breaking NATO up, that he's not listening to NATO leaders. And at the end of the day, NATO rallied behind the president, and they began to pay their way with regard to military, the military might in the region, etc. Look, it's easy to blame the United States for everything. But the reality is the Iranian government is not taking care of its people. The United States government is not the threat that Iran needs to worry about. It's its own people. Just look at what we're seeing. They're out on the streets in Iran. They're tired of their government. They're tired of corruption. They're tired of Iran sending more money to create mischief around the world than their own people. The President of the United States has made it clear that he loves the Iranian people. We in America want good relations with the people. But it's the government that needs to be held accountable. It's the government in Iran that needs to be held responsible for its own actions.
But Anise, in reality, there have been 11 consecutive reports by the nuclear agency, and all of them said that Iran was complying. So if you are now any other country in the world, and if you are North Korea, for example, and you're looking at what is happening, why would you even negotiate with the US if, a change of commander-in-chief will also mean a change of agreement?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In terms of how trustworthy the United States looks to the international community. This is something that, of course, has been raised by a number of countries, including, of course, the Iranians. But also going back to Steve's point, I think about the economic pressure and the role that sanctions are playing, and also the reaction of the different parties and companies to these sanctions. I just wanted to remind him also of the fact that already in 2010, 2012, there was the strongest set of sanctions which were imposed against Iran. There was a UN Security Council resolution. There were unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States, by the European Union, and by a number of additional countries, Australia, Canada, you name it. And even then, not only the Iranian regime did not collapse economically, but also the whole negotiation point that he's making did not really change. The change came once Rouhani came to power. Iran dropped the zero enrichment policy, and a number of issues came to line. So either we come to the realization that pressure, economic pressure, did not work in the past, and we are far away from the type and level of economic pressure that was exerted in the past now because of the lack of global support to the United States, or there will be a continued lack of strategic policy from the United States towards Iran moving forward.
Okay. Scott Lucas, now, Europe is not happy about this. It made it clear. Yet Steve has a point that several companies have already decided to comply with these sanctions. So does he also have a point that in the end, Europe will have to follow suit, or does it have any exit of all of that? Or will it have to develop its own policy? What can it do, really?
The EU can protect smaller companies, maybe medium-sized companies, but it can't necessarily cover billions of dollars in protracted legal action. So that's why you've seen companies like Total in France, like PSA, the French car manufacturer, like Siemens and Daimler in Germany saying we have to suspend business for now. But beyond that, then you've got this fantasy world that Steve and that Donald Trump are in. Look, Donald Trump is not beloved by NATO members. That was a fantasy that you just heard there. The idea has been, not only on this issue, but on others, that the U.S. can bully others. Emmanuel Macron appealed to Trump, do not pull out of this deal. Theresa May appealed to Trump, do not pull out of this deal. And the Americans threw that back in their faces. So in the longer term, the question is, where will Europe stand economically and politically, not only on the Iran issue, but on other issues, when you can no longer trust the administration in Washington?
And Steve, this sort of rift with the EU, isn't that something that concerns Washington, concerns the Trump administration? It has been since at least World War II, the closest ally. Things are changing now in the world. Isn't that a concern at all?
President Trump is known as a great negotiator. Look, there were 3 presidents of the Baltic states here in the United States a couple of months ago. And the common theme that they articulated at their press conference was that we trust Donald Trump. We trust his judgment. There is no fantasy world here. It is not a fantasy when the President of the United States somehow, through good negotiations, got NATO countries to pay their fair share with regard to economic and military aid. That is exactly what happened. That is exactly what happened. And,
no, it's factually incorrect.
You talked earlier about
campaign
talk. This is not campaign talk. This is reality on the ground. And you're doing what the U.S. Media does. You're creating a false narrative based on nonsense. The fact of the matter is Donald Trump said that he would protect the American people first, and he's doing that.
Scott.
That's reality.
You don't seem to agree with any of that.
Well, okay. Look, I mean, for what it matters on the NATO issue, the NATO members did not agree and bow down to Donald Trump. They agreed to continue with the path of increased expenditure that they've been on since 2014. So that's Washington's spin. On the broader point, and the important one you're talking about Iran, is that you have this sort of not only the idea that if Donald Trump shouts, everyone will follow, and that makes him a great negotiator, when in fact there's a lot of distrust as Donald Trump as a negotiator, including amongst the leaders of the Baltic states, by the way. But then it's also the idea that in Iran, the Iranian people are just waiting for liberation. They're waiting for regime change. And if you put this together, what it's saying is that the Iranian people who are caught between hardliners in their system and the Americans, if the Americans put an economic gun to their heads and say, rise up, that's when the Iranians will hit the streets.
Actually, some opponents to the regime in Iran say that usually when sanctions happen or hard situations like that, it actually emboldens the regime. Moving on, Anise, I just also want, if you're Iran, post the deal in 2015, Iran has looked to Europe mainly for its contracts and its business dealings. Now it's looking at Russia, for example, as a plan B. Russia and China are both against the unilateral move of the US. Will we see Iran moving a bit more eastwards, or will they also be a bit more pragmatic and say, well, at the end of the day, President Trump is in power for 2 years, maybe 6 at the most, and they'll just ride the wave? After all, they're used to that.
Well, I think it's going to be a mixture of these two tendencies. Of course, we know that the preference of the Rouhani administration has been, since the very beginning, since 2013, to improve relations with the European partners. And he has stressed that from a political perspective and economic perspective. So I don't see the European preference dropping anytime soon. Of course, because of the limitation of the European tools available to protect what Scott was mentioning and referring to, so small and medium enterprises, it's going to be difficult for Iran just to rely on Europe. So they are going to look at Russia and China. We have already seen a number of statements and discussion about new agreements on the energy sector, infrastructure sector between Iran and Russia and China. And that has been also the tendency that we have seen during the toughest round of sanctions, the 2010-2014 period, in particular, to basically enable Iran to continue, to some extent, its oil export and its investment in the gas fields, but also into the infrastructure by looking into the Eastern partners. So I think it's going to be a mixture of the two policies. If Rouhani could choose, it would go with Europe. We know that by fact. But because it will need to prioritize also the situation of the Iranian economy and also the continuation of its relationship with Russia and China, who have been supporting Iran throughout all the difficulties and all the sanction imposition, then these partners are going to be also looked at very closely by Iran as well.
Okay, Steve, so now President Trump said clearly, you either do business with us or you do business with Iran. China said it will continue to do business with Iran. Russia is pledging possibly up to $15 billion investment in the oil and gas industry in Iran. The EU might have pass a legislation that will protect its own companies. Where does that really leave President Trump on all of this? He's quite isolated from his diplomatic partners on this specific issue.
Well, a couple of points. The economy of Russia is not good. China's having some economic problems. At the end of the day, each of the countries in the EU are going to have to answer one question. Do you trust Iran, Russia, and China, or do you trust the United States? And at the end of the day, we will find that they trust the United States. But saying that, all of what they're doing, they're positioning themselves into bringing their ideas, as we said earlier, to the negotiating table with President Trump. So all this is a family squabble. NATO, the EU, the European countries who we've had relationships forever, we're going to continue to have great relations. But the president is a tough negotiator. And at the end of the day, you either deal with a country, Iran, that exports terror, that exports mischief worldwide, or you're going to work with the United States government, who is trying to lead the world, not only the United States, but the world into some stability and peace. So that's the answer that these individuals are going to have to, or the question that they're going to have to answer, and they'll answer it by coming eventually to the side of the United States on this issue.
Scott Lucas, one could also argue that actually all the U.S. administrations have had more or less the same kind of approach when it wants to impose something on the international community. Maybe the difference is not in substance, but actually in form. But it's nothing new coming out of Washington at the end of the day.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because I think we have seen previous administrations try to get very tough on Iran. We certainly have seen that, for example, with the George W. Bush administration, when they even considered regime change. We saw it with the Obama administration, when in fact, they took a fairly tough line to lead up to the 2015 agreement. But the huge difference here is that there was cooperation between those administrations and between partners such as the Europeans, and indeed between Russia and China, who were other parties to the agreement, because you knew the rules. You knew you could work with the State Department. You knew you could work with the National Security Council, and there was an element of trust here. What has happened is that a combination of certain officials in Washington, such as the National Security Advisor John Bolton, who is committed to regime change, and just the volatile nature of Donald Trump, who has very little knowledge about the issue, but just wanted to rip this up because Barack Obama did it, means that the rules are gone. You can't trust dealing with Trump. And again, Steve wants to make this into a fantasy where Trump is like the leader of this coalition. Well, I'd love a rainbow unicorn for Christmas, but it ain't going to happen. I think we will, however, see countries be cautious. We will see, for example, China be cautious as to how much it defies the U.S. We will see countries like India and Russia maneuver. So I think in the short term, the U.S. probably holds certain cards to put pressure on the Iranians, to cause cracks in the economy. But it's beyond the short term that we get real uncertainty, not only about the relationship with Iran, but indeed the U.S. position in the region and beyond.
And Steve, you seem to have something to add.
Yeah. Look, under the Obama administration, and Scott, I'd love you to respond to this. What about that jet with cold cash, millions of dollars of cash in the secret of the night landing in Iran? That's how the administrations dealt with. That's how they dealt with Iran. In secret, behind everybody's back. We have a president of the United States who's very transparent, who's very clear on his positions. No one has to ever guess where he is. So you want to talk fantasy? Well, there was a fantasy land when the Obama administration was in, thinking that, and this is a problem with our country before Trump, that we could just use our dollars to pay everybody off. Well, Donald Trump is not going to do that. There's never going to be a plane load of cold cash going to Iran again.
And I'm just going to, we're running out of time, so I just want to give the final word to Anise. I mean, you've heard the two gentlemen here. But again, going back to Iran and indeed to the rest of the world, do you think that with all what's going on, we might see a new way coming out from the EU on how to deal with, for example, Washington, primarily Washington, I would say? Are they going to be able to forge their own European way and be a bit more independent? And briefly, please, because we're reaching the end of the show.
That's a very good question. I think it's very noteworthy to understand that the Europeans were not thinking that we're going to be able to reach a consensus, a unanimous decision to implement the legislation that was just approved, the EU blocking regulation, which might be a political tool and not be as effective as we wish in terms of protecting the European companies and financial institutions from the US's secondary sanctions. But I think because of precisely the nature of the situation and the fact that they don't trust the United States anymore on the Iran issue, even if they have been trying to work with them, they saw that the decision was taken unilaterally and without consideration of the consequences. And most importantly, Iran is abiding by its own obligation, and therefore the Europeans don't really see any reason why the JCPOA should be jeopardized. So I think the situation is very complicated.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to interrupt you because we have actually reached the end of the show. So I'm going to thank our guests, Stephen Rogers, Scott Lucas, and Anise Basiri Tabrisi. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Huda Abdelhamid, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.